cheating wife tried Sumi came back and warned me. I want half of your money, so I destroyed her. And now that it's gone, you come to me, Kellen replied, his tone cold. Is this guilt, Brielle? Or regret? Tears streamed down Brielle's face as she whispered, Isn't there any way to fix this? Hey. How was your day? We meet again in Reddit cheating stories. It might sound strange, but there are some women, they cheat on their husbands and they act like they are hurt, and they are really greedy. Today's story will give you a deeper understanding of such a type of person. The courtroom was silent, tension thick in the air, as Serena's voice quivered with desperation. I want half of your money. I gave you everything. Kellen, composed and unshaken, rose to his feet, his voice cold and measured. Everything? You mocked me, abandoned me, and chose someone else's wealth over our family. You deserve nothing. His legal team methodically dismantled her every claim with damning evidence. Texts, videos, and testimonies painting a stark picture of betrayal and greed. The judge's gavel fell, the sound echoing through the room as the case was dismissed with prejudice. Serena's face crumbled, her expression a mixture of shock and despair as Kellen walked out, victorious. He didn't look back, leaving her to face the ruins of her choices. The morning sun filtered through the blinds of Kellen Hayes' home office, casting golden beams across the polished hardwood floor. The space was a reflection of its owner, disciplined and efficient. A sleek black desk anchored the room, hosting an array of humming monitors displaying lines of cascading code. The faint aroma of freshly brewed coffee mixed with the metallic tang of electronics, creating an atmosphere of quiet focus. Shelves filled with tech manuals and algorithmic theory books lined the walls, while a corkboard to his left displayed sketches and notes mapping the evolution of payer technologies, his revolutionary payment processing platform poised to disrupt the industry. Kellen's fingers moved with precision across his mechanical keyboard, the rhythmic clicks blending seamlessly with the soft hum of his machines. This office was his sanctuary, a place where time seemed to pause and his vision could take form. A photo on his desk caught his eye, a younger version of himself standing beside Serena Mororo. Her sharp smile once mirrored his own ambition. For a moment, the memory pulled him back a decade to a time when their paths first crossed. At 26, Kellen was a junior developer at a mid-sized tech firm, writing code for uninspiring projects. His days blurred into monotony until Serena walked into the office. As a marketing consultant hired to revamp the company's image, she exuded confidence, commanding attention with every word and gesture. They first spoke in the break room over stale coffee. "You're wasted here," she said bluntly, her sharp gaze locking onto his. "You've got potential, but you'll never reach it if you stay comfortable." Her words struck a chord, igniting a spark Kellen hadn't realized was there. Over the following weeks, their conversations grew personal. Serena's charisma was magnetic, and her relentless drive inspired him to think bigger. "You could be more than just another coder," she told him one evening over dinner, her ruby-red lips curling into a knowing smile. "But you need to leave this safety net behind." Her encouragement became his mantra as he sketched out the first concepts for what would later become payer technologies. Serena's belief in him was intoxicating, but it came with an undercurrent of expectation, her vision of success intertwined with his. Back in the present, Kellen brushed aside the hollow ache of that memory. He had come too far to dwell on the past. The faint ping of a notification on his monitor drew his focus, a transaction report showing stellar results. He clicked into the financial dashboard, where the numbers painted an undeniable picture of success. Payer Technologies was already generating $250,000 in monthly revenue before its official launch. Investors were lining up, and the platform's performance exceeded even Kellen's most optimistic projections. He allowed himself a rare smile, fleeting but genuine. This was his victory, built on sleepless nights, relentless work, and a vision that refused to waver. The echoes of Serena's betrayal no longer stung the way they once had. Instead, they served as a reminder of how far he'd come. Kellen didn't just survive, he thrived. And now, as the sun climbed higher, illuminating the pages of his next chapter, he knew one thing for certain. He was just getting started. The courtroom was silent as Serena's voice trembled, laden with desperation. "I want half of your money. I gave you everything." Kellen, calm and composed, rose to his feet. His voice, cold and deliberate, cut through the tension. "Everything? You mocked me, abandoned me, and chose wealth over family. You deserve nothing." His legal team dismantled her claims with precision. Texts, videos, and testimonies that painted a stark picture of her betrayal. The judge's gavel fell, dismissing the case with prejudice. Serena's face crumbled, a portrait of disbelief and defeat. Kellen didn't spare her a glance as he walked out, leaving her in the ruins of her choices. The morning light streamed through the blinds of Kellen Hayes' home office, casting golden rays across the polished hardwood floor. The space was a reflection of its owner, meticulously organized and ruthlessly efficient. A sleek desk held an array of glowing monitors, each humming softly as lines of code scrolled across their screens. Shelves lined with books on algorithmic theory and startup strategy framed the room. To his left, a corkboard bristled with notes and diagrams chronicling the rise of payer technologies. It was a sanctuary for creation, free of distractions, where Kellen's vision had transformed from scribbled ideas into a thriving enterprise. His eyes drifted briefly to the closet, where a pristine Tom Ford suit hung. He'd bought it months ago, imagining the triumphant moment he'd reveal his success to those who once doubted him. Back then, he thought Serena would see the man she had underestimated. Now he knew better. Her approval, the validation he had chased for so long, no longer mattered. The mechanical click of his keyboard echoed as Kellen returned to work, refining the algorithm that powered his revolutionary payment platform. But even as he typed, his thoughts lingered on the past. The harsh words, the pointed barbs, the quiet nights spent coding out of spite rather than ambition. A knock broke his focus. Dan Rivers, his business partner and oldest friend, stepped inside, balancing a coffee cup and tablet. "Another batch just cleared, didn't it?" Dan grinned as he sank into the chair opposite Kellen. "I can see it on your face. How much this time?" $447,000 in an hour, Kellen replied, leaning back in his chair. "The system's running smoother than ever. Investors are doubling down." Dan's grin widened. "Do you realize what we've built? This isn't just some payment processor. This is a juggernaut. You've taken every critique, every dismissal, and turned it into," he gestured around the room. "This." Kellen's expression didn't change. "You think they see it now?" "Who? Serena? Trevor? The whole damn neighborhood?" Dan leaned forward, his tone turning serious. "They'll see it soon enough. Once the media gets a hold of these numbers, they'll know exactly what they walked away from. And when they do," he smirked, "it'll be too late." The words stirred something deep within Kellen. He thought back to the first time Serena had dismissed his work as a hobby, a casual remark that cut deeper than it should have. And Trevor Walsh, the neighbor who had sneered at his ambition, had once said, "Why build something new when you can buy something proven?" That memory had fueled Kellen through sleepless nights, his fingers flying across the keyboard as frustration turned into progress. Now, the platform was a well-oiled machine, processing transactions faster than anything on the market. Kellen's phone buzzed on the desk. He glanced at the screen, his jaw tightening at the sight of Serena's name. "Serena, don't forget Brielle's dance showcase tonight. Try not to embarrass us with one of your cheap suits." His eyes flicked to the Tom Ford suit again. For a moment, he considered wearing it, showing up, and proving her wrong. But then he deleted the message and turned back to Dan. "Let them underestimate me," Kellen said, his voice resolute. "They'll see the truth soon enough." Dan raised his coffee in a mock toast. To the launch, to shutting them up, and to making Trevor Walsh choke on his old money pride. Kellen allowed himself a rare, genuine laugh. "Let's make it happen." As the sun dipped below the horizon, Kellen remained in his office, driven by a quiet but unyielding purpose. The monitors before him displayed a cascade of achievements, transaction volumes climbing, retention metrics glowing green, and investors eager for a larger stake. Yet beneath the numbers lay a deeper truth. Success wasn't about proving Serena or Trevor wrong anymore. It wasn't about the suits or the showmanship. It was about proving something to himself, that he could take every setback, every insult, every dismissal, and turn them into fuel. That his vision was worth fighting for, even when no one else believed in it. As he typed the final line of code for the day, Kellen felt a calm determination settle over him. The doubts and betrayals of the past were no longer weights around his neck. They were stepping stones to something greater. The glow of the monitors reflected in his eyes, sharp and focused. His path was clear, and he had no intention of slowing down. The courtroom was silent as Serena's voice trembled, laden with desperation. "I want half of your money. I gave you everything." Kellen, calm and composed, rose to his feet. His voice, cold and deliberate, cut through the tension. "Everything? You mocked me, abandoned me, and chose wealth over family. You deserve nothing." His legal team dismantled her claims with precision. Texts, videos, and testimonies that painted a stark picture of her betrayal. The judge's gavel fell, dismissing the case with prejudice. Serena's face crumbled, a portrait of disbelief and defeat. Kellen didn't spare her a glance as he walked out, leaving her in the ruins of her choices. The warmth of a simpler time washed over Kellen as he glanced at the framed photo on his desk. Brielle, just 7 years old, stood beaming in her first recital costume. Serena, smiling brightly, had her hand resting lightly on his shoulder. It was the last time he could recall them feeling like a real family. The memory came flooding back, a chilly December evening filled with Brielle's infectious excitement. She had begged them to come early to her recital so they could watch her warm up, her giggles echoing through the auditorium. After the performance, they had gone for ice cream despite the freezing temperatures. Brielle danced around the parking lot, tapping out rhythms even without music. "You're a good father," Serena had said softly, her hand brushing his arm. For a brief moment, there was no tension, no judgment, only warmth. The sharp ping of a text jolted him back to the present. "Serena, Brielle's going to perform a solo. Try showing some enthusiasm for once." Kellen sighed, setting his phone aside. He was proud of Brielle, always had been, but Serena's messages carried an edge designed to provoke. His gaze shifted to the Tom Ford suit hanging in the closet, pristine and untouched. It was supposed to symbolize a moment of triumph, a bridge to reunite his fractured family. But that moment had passed. Serena had made it clear she wasn't interested in his success unless it came adorned with the trappings of wealth she envied in others. The comparisons had begun subtly, growing sharper over time. "Did you see what Sarah's husband bought her for their anniversary?" Serena had asked once, showing him a photo of an elaborate diamond necklace. "He knows how to treat his wife." The comments had stung, but Kellen brushed them off, thinking they were passing remarks. They weren't. Over time, Trevor Walsh, a wealthy neighbor, became a regular point of comparison. His luxury cars, sprawling estate, and European vacations seemed to embody everything Serena thought Kellen lacked. At their first dinner party at the Walsh estate, Kellen had felt distinctly out of place. Trevor had shown off his car collection, each vehicle worth more than Kellen's annual salary at the time. That night, Serena's quiet disappointment had been unmistakable. "We could have this too," she had said when they returned home, her tone cutting. "If you just pushed yourself harder." Kellen hadn't argued. Instead, he spent that night coding into the early hours, pouring his frustration into the fledgling ideas for his startup. Now, years later, Serena's dissatisfaction had seeped into Brielle. Once curious and eager, Brielle had become fixated on designer clothes and social media. "Dad," she had said recently, her tone filled with disdain, "can you get a better car? Madison's dad just bought a Ferrari. It's embarrassing to be seen in your old truck." The words hit harder than he expected, not because of the car, but because of the shift in her values. She sounded just like Serena, valuing appearances over substance. His phone buzzed again. This time, it was Brielle. "Brielle, don't forget my allowance. Madison's dad is taking us shopping, and I don't want to look broke." Kellen typed a reply. "Shouldn't you be in school?" The response came immediately. "Half day. Told you last week." "God, do you even listen?" Her dismissive tone echoed in his mind long after the conversation ended. Kellen clenched his jaw and turned back to the monitors on his desk. The numbers didn't lie. His work was paying off. His platform was generating millions in revenue, attracting attention from investors and industry leaders. But the validation he once sought from Serena, from Brielle, no longer mattered. They couldn't see the value in his work, but that was their loss. He stood, walking to the closet. The Tom Ford suit hung there, a relic of a time when he believed success could mend the cracks in his family. Now, it was a reminder of how much he had outgrown their shallow expectations. Kellen returned to his desk, his resolve hardening. He wasn't working to prove Serena wrong or to win Brielle's approval. He was working for something far greater, his own vision and legacy. The sharp click of his keyboard filled the room as he resumed refining his algorithm. His focus was unshaken. He would no longer seek validation from those who didn't deserve it. His success wasn't about the people who had doubted him. It was about the man he had become despite them. Kellen sat at his desk, staring at the text from Brielle on his phone. Madison's dad is taking us shopping, and I don't want to look broke. The words lingered, not just for their bluntness, but for what they represented, a growing chasm between him and his daughter. It wasn't just an allowance request or a dismissive tone. It was the stark realization that Brielle, once his curious, bright-eyed little girl, now viewed the world through a lens crafted by materialism and status. He couldn't pinpoint when things had shifted. Brielle had always been inquisitive, spending hours perched in his office as a child, asking endless questions about his work. "How does the computer know what to do, Daddy?" she'd asked, her wide eyes lighting up with wonder as he simplified the intricacies of coding. He could still hear her laughter when she successfully ran her first basic script, a moment of shared joy and connection. But that spark of curiosity had dulled over the years, replaced by an obsession with designer brands, influencer culture, and the validation of her wealthier peers. And Kellen knew Serena had played a significant role in shaping that transformation. The shift had been insidious, creeping in like a slow tide that gradually eroded the foundation of their family. It began with subtle remarks from Serena, tiny seeds of discontent planted in casual conversations. "Trevor just remodeled their kitchen," she'd said one evening at dinner, her tone casual but pointed. "They put in one of those imported Italian ranges. It makes ours look so outdated." Kellen had dismissed it as harmless commentary, but the comparisons became more frequent, more pointed. Trevor Walsh and his wife Eleanor, with their sprawling estate and luxury cars, became a constant presence in their conversations, looming over their modest life like a silent judge. By the time the Walshes hosted their first neighborhood dinner party, Serena's envy was palpable. She had meticulously planned their outfits, ensuring they'd meet the Walshes' standards. But the night only highlighted the gulf Serena felt between their lives. Trevor had shown off his vintage wine collection, casually boasting about bottles worth more than Kellen's monthly income. Serena laughed too hard at his jokes, her admiration thinly veiled. Later, as they walked to their car, her dissatisfaction bubbled to the surface. "You don't have to pretend that didn't bother you," she said sharply. "Don't you want more for us?" "For Brielle, we have plenty," Kellen replied evenly. "A home, security, each other. Plenty," she scoffed, gesturing at their surroundings. "That's what people say when they're settling." Those conversations set the stage for Brielle's transformation. Serena's increasing fixation on what their family lacked seeped into their daughter's perspective. Kellen saw it in the way Brielle spoke about her friends. Madison's dad bought her a Tesla for her sweet 16, she'd said one day, scrolling through her phone. "It's so cool, isn't it?" Caught off guard, Kellen responded absently, "That's nice. But what's wrong with waiting until you're older to drive?" Brielle rolled her eyes. "Seriously, it's not about driving. It's about showing people you've made it. Don't you get that?" Her tone wasn't just impatient. It carried an edge of disbelief, as though Kellen's values were completely alien to her. That moment stuck with him, a glaring warning sign he couldn't ignore. The influence of her wealthier peers only deepened. Serena often took Brielle to lunches with Eleanor Walsh and her circle of socialites. Brielle soaked up their world of luxury vacations and designer handbags, adopting their language and priorities as her own. One evening, she'd asked him, "Dad, can you get me the new Chanel sneakers?" Holding up her phone, she displayed the price tag, $1,200. Kellen raised an eyebrow. $1,200 for a pair of shoes? Brielle, that's not reasonable. Her expression darkened. Madison has them. Everyone has them. You don't get it because you don't care about how people see us. That's not true, Kellen said, keeping his voice steady. I care about the example I set and the values I teach you. Shoes like these won't define your worth. Well, they do to other people, she snapped before storming off. Conversations like that became a recurring theme, each one driving home the same painful truth. Brielle's worldview was increasingly shaped by the shallow priorities Serena had fostered. And now, with her latest text demanding more money for a shopping trip, Kellen realized how far they had drifted from the life he had envisioned for them. He clenched his jaw, the sting of disappointment settling deep in his chest. Brielle's childhood curiosity and authenticity had been buried under layers of status-seeking and superficiality. The bright-eyed little girl who once marveled at his world of logic and creativity was almost unrecognizable. But as he stared at her message, he made a silent vow. He couldn't undo the past or the influence Serena had over her, but he could still show Brielle a different path, a path rooted in substance, not appearances. And he would start by living that truth himself. Kellen froze mid-keystroke, his breath catching as Serena's voice carried through the slightly open window. Her tone, measured and sharp, cut through the quiet hum of his office. Yes, everything's arranged, she said, pacing the driveway. Her words were low and deliberate, but there was an unmistakable edge of satisfaction. No, he doesn't suspect a thing. He's too wrapped up in his precious computer programs. The air seemed to shift in the room. Kellen leaned back in his chair, his pulse quickening. He strained to hear more, the weight of her words pressing down like a stone. The movers will handle it while he's in his office, Serena continued. By this time tomorrow, Brielle and I will be settled in Beverly Hills. And Kellen? She laughed softly, the sound colder than any argument or dismissal he'd endured before. He'll be nothing but an unfortunate memory. The betrayal hit him like a punch to the chest. He stared at the photo on his desk, the one of him, Serena, and Brielle from years ago. Their smiles, once a symbol of everything he held dear, now felt like a cruel illusion. Serena's next words cut even deeper. Brielle's completely on board, she said, her tone dripping with disdain. She understands what a loser her father is. Of course she does. I've made sure of that. Kellen's hands clenched into fists as the truth settled over him. This wasn't just Serena's betrayal. It was Brielle's too. His daughter, the curious little girl who used to sit on his lap and marvel at his work, had turned against him. The glow of the monitors suddenly felt suffocating. Their once comforting hum now a cruel reminder of how he'd poured everything into his work, thinking he was building a better future for his family. He had been blindsided, his focus on his vision, allowing the cracks in his family to grow unnoticed until they became an unbridgeable divide. As the evening wore on, Kellen sat in the living room, waiting for Serena to come inside. His mind raced, torn between confronting her outright and holding his silence until he had a plan. He needed to know the full scope of what was happening, not just for his sake, but to ensure they couldn't take everything he'd built. The door clicked open, and Serena stepped inside, her phone still in her hand. Her face shifted when she saw him, her confident expression flickering with brief surprise before she composed herself. "You're still up?" she asked casually, setting her phone on the counter. Kellen's gaze didn't waver. "I overheard your conversation," he said evenly, his voice betraying none of the storm brewing inside him. Serena froze, her composure cracking. "What are you talking about?" "Don't," Kellen said sharply, standing. "I heard you. Beverly Hills. The movers. Everything. You've been planning this for how long?" Her silence spoke louder than any denial. She crossed her arms, her eyes narrowing. "And what if I have?" she said, her tone defiant. "You're so obsessed with your little tech empire that you've forgotten what it means to be a husband, a father. Brielle and I deserve better." Kellen's jaw tightened. "Better? You mean Trevor Walsh's idea of better? Lavish vacations and overpriced handbags?" Serena's eyes flashed with anger. It's not about Trevor, she snapped. It's about security, stability, things you can't seem to provide because you're too busy chasing some pipe dream. That pipe dream pays for this house, Brielle's school, and every other so-called stability you've taken for granted. Kellen shot back, his voice rising. Serena scoffed. Barely. And it's not enough. Not for me, not for Brielle. The mention of his daughter reignited his anger. You've turned her against me, he said, his voice trembling. Do you even realize what you've done? She used to believe in me, in what I was building. Now she sees me through your eyes as a failure. Maybe you should ask yourself why, Serena said coldly. It's not just me, Kellen. You've buried yourself in your work, ignoring what we needed right in front of you. Kellen's gaze hardened. What you needed wasn't a family. It was a status symbol. And when I didn't fit your mold, you decided to leave. That's not on me, Serena. That's on you. For the first time, Serena faltered. Her defiance gave way to something that looked almost like regret, but it was fleeting. She grabbed her phone. Her voice clipped as she said, "You'll hear from my lawyer." As she walked away, Kellen stood rooted in place, his heart pounding. The divide between them was now an unbridgeable chasm, but his resolve solidified. This wasn't just about betrayal anymore. It was about proving to himself and to them that the vision he'd dedicated his life to was worth every sacrifice. As the door closed behind Serena, Kellen turned back to his office. The quiet hum of his monitors greeted him like an old friend. He sat down, his fingers hovering over the keyboard, and began typing with renewed focus. He had lost them, but he wouldn't lose himself. Kellen sat at his desk, staring at the text from Brielle on his phone. Madison's dad is taking us shopping, and I don't want to look broke. The words burned in his mind, not just for their content, but for what they represented, the growing distance between him and his daughter. The front door opened, and Serena walked in, her phone in hand and an air of composure surrounding her. She barely glanced at Kellen as she kicked off her designer heels. Still working? She asked casually. You should take a break sometime. He didn't respond immediately, watching her with a mixture of disbelief and clarity. How long had she been planning this? How much of what they had shared was a lie? Serena finally noticed his silence and raised an eyebrow. Is something wrong? Kellen chose his words carefully, his voice steady. I overheard you on the phone earlier. For a split second, something flickered in her eyes. Fear, perhaps, but it quickly disappeared behind her usual mask of indifference. Oh, she replied coolly. And what did you overhear? Enough, Kellen said, his voice quieter now, but laced with restrained anger. About the movers, about Brielle, about Asher. Serena's expression hardened, and she crossed her arms. Then I guess we can skip the pretense. You weren't supposed to find out until tomorrow. Her casual cruelty stunned him. You were just going to take Brielle and leave? No explanation? No discussion? Serena shrugged as if it were the most natural thing in the world. What's there to discuss, Kellen? You've been checked out for years. Do you think I haven't noticed how much time you spend in that office? Chasing some pipe dream? Brielle and I have been waiting for you to wake up and realize what you're losing. His voice rose, incredulous. What I'm losing? I've been working to build something for us, for all of us. And this is how you repay me? Serena scoffed, her tone dripping with disdain. You call that building something? Playing entrepreneur while real men like Asher are out there making actual money? You're pathetic, Kellen. Always have been. Her words were a gut punch, but her next admission cut even deeper. Brielle sees it too, she continued. She knows you'll never measure up. That's why she's coming with me. She deserves better. Kellen's fists clenched at his sides. You've poisoned her against me. Serena's voice was cold and deliberate. No, Kellen. I've shown her the truth. The next morning, Kellen woke to the sound of movement downstairs. Boxes were being packed, furniture shifted, and the quiet dismantling of their shared life echoed through the house. He stood at the top of the stairs, watching the movers carry out piece after piece of the life he thought he was building for his family. Brielle appeared at the bottom of the stairs, her backpack slung over one shoulder. She glanced up at him briefly before looking away, her expression unreadable. Brielle? Kellen called out, his voice breaking slightly. We need to talk." She barely paused. "What's there to talk about?" she replied flatly. "Mom already explained everything." She explained her version of things, Kellen said, descending the stairs. "But I want to hear from you. Is this what you really want?" Brielle hesitated, her fingers tightening around the strap of her bag. "It's what's best for us, Dad. You don't get it. You're too focused on your company to see how miserable we've been." "Miserable?" Kellen echoed, his voice filled with disbelief. "You think I've been working this hard for myself? Everything I've done has been for this family. For you?" Her gaze hardened. "If that were true, you'd be here for us, not locked away in your office." Kellen's voice softened, pleading now. "I've been building something that could change our lives. You used to understand that. You used to believe in me. That was before I realized belief doesn't pay the bills." Brielle snapped. "Madison's dad buys her everything she wants. He takes her on trips, throws her parties. Meanwhile, I can't even get the shoes I want without a lecture about values." Her words were a final blow. Kellen stood frozen, the weight of her choice pressing down on him. "I hope you find what you're looking for," he said quietly, stepping aside to let her pass. "But know this. Once you walk out that door, things will never be the same." Brielle hesitated for a fraction of a second, her eyes flicking toward his. But then she adjusted her bag and walked out, leaving Kellen standing alone in the empty hallway. Hours later, the house was eerily quiet. Kellen sat in his office, staring at the financial dashboard on his monitor. The glowing numbers were evidence of his hard work, his vision, and his success. But now, they felt hollow, overshadowed by the emptiness that filled his chest. Serena's words echoed in his mind. "You're nothing but a memory." He leaned back in his chair, exhaling slowly. If that's how they wanted to see him, so be it. Kellen turned back to his screen, his jaw tightening as his hands moved over the keyboard. If Serena and Brielle had chosen a life defined by superficial wealth and fleeting comforts, he wouldn't stop them. But he would keep building. For himself, for his future, and for the unshakable knowledge that what he created would stand the test of time, long after their fleeting illusions had faded. Kellen sat in the dim light of his office, the silence pressing in like a heavy weight. The faint hum of his computer monitors was the only sound, a quiet reminder of the world he had built within these walls. Every instinct screamed for action, to confront Serena and Brielle, to demand answers that might dull the ache in his chest. But he didn't move. He simply sat there, his hands gripping the edge of his desk, his knuckles white. The betrayal was a raw, open wound. The people he loved most, his wife, his daughter, had not only left him, but done so with disdain. Serena's scornful laughter and sharp words about his ambition replayed in his mind, and Brielle's cold indifference struck even deeper. They had chosen status and wealth over the values he had tried to instill in them. But Kellen knew anger wouldn't serve him now. The fire simmering beneath his surface was powerful, but it needed to be harnessed. Slowly, deliberately, he exhaled, forcing the tension from his body. He couldn't control their decisions. He could only control his response. He turned to his computer screens, the bright glow lighting his face. The financial dashboard displayed numbers that had once filled him with pride. $250,000 in monthly revenue and climbing. Investors were eager. The platform's performance exceeded all projections, and the official launch was just weeks away. This was the result of his sacrifices, the validation of every late night spent working when others doubted him. As the anger cooled, it solidified into something unshakable: resolve. They had underestimated him. Serena had dismissed him as a dreamer. Brielle had accused him of being disconnected. But Kellen knew better. His work mattered. His vision mattered. He would prove it. Not with words, not with confrontation, but with a success so undeniable that it would ripple through every corner of the life they had abandoned. The door creaked open, and Dan Rivers stepped into the office holding 2 coffees. He set one on the desk and sat down across from Kellen. "You look like hell," Dan said bluntly, studying him. "What's going on?" Kellen hesitated before replying, his voice tight but controlled. "Serena and Brielle are leaving, moving in with Asher Calloway. They've been planning it for months." Dan's eyebrows shot up. "What? I overheard her on the phone, Kellen said. Movers are coming tomorrow. Dan leaned back, his expression shifting from shock to anger. That's cold. Even for her. Kellen nodded, his jaw clenched. She called me a failure. Said Brielle deserves better. And apparently, Asher is better. Dan let out a low whistle. So, what are you going to do? Nothing, Kellen said firmly. Dan blinked. Nothing? I'm not going to beg, and I'm not going to argue. If they think I'm a failure, fine. I'll let my success speak for itself. Dan studied him for a moment before nodding. All right, he said. Then let's make sure that success is loud enough to drown out every word they've ever said. The following days passed in a blur of focus. Kellen threw himself into his startup with renewed purpose. The pain of Serena and Brielle's departure lingered, but he channeled it into his work, using the hurt as fuel to push forward. Every keystroke was deliberate, every decision calculated. He refined the platform's algorithms to ensure they surpassed anything on the market. He sharpened the investor pitch deck, fine-tuning every slide to perfection. And he worked late into the night, the glow of his monitors illuminating the determination etched into his features. But the transformation wasn't just in his work. Kellen himself began to change. The man who once sought Serena's approval was gone, replaced by someone stronger, someone who no longer needed validation from anyone else. The doubts that had once lingered in his mind were extinguished by an unshakable belief in himself and his vision. Kellen didn't just want success. He was building a legacy, something greater than himself, something no one could take away. As he sat in his office late one evening, the monitors before him glowing with proof of his progress, Kellen felt a strange sense of peace. Serena and Brielle had made their choices, but so had he. And while they had walked away, chasing fleeting comforts, Kellen was carving a path to something far more lasting. Let them doubt him. Let them believe he had failed. When the time came, and it would come, they would see the truth. And by then, they would find themselves on the outside, looking in. One evening, Dan stopped by the office again, carrying a bottle of whiskey in one hand and a determined expression on his face. He poured 2 glasses, sliding one across the desk to Kellen. To the launch, Dan said, raising his glass. And to proving every doubter wrong, Kellen clinked his glass against Dan's, a faint but genuine smile tugging at the corners of his lips. To building something that lasts. They drank in silence for a moment before Dan spoke again, his tone softer. You know, what they did is going to sting for a while. Kellen nodded slowly. I know. And you're just okay with letting it go like this? I'm not letting it go, Kellen replied, his voice steady. I'm just not wasting my energy on anger. They don't believe in me? Fine. But I believe in me. And when they realize what they walked away from, it'll be too late. Dan grinned, lifting his glass again. That's the Kellen I like to see. Underscore, 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 underscore. As the days turned into weeks, the echoes of his old life faded. Serena and Brielle had moved out, leaving behind only faint reminders of the family they once were. The quiet of the house felt both strange and liberating. Kellen didn't dwell on the loss. He had a company to build, a dream to realize, and a point to prove. Not to them, but to himself. The official launch of Pyre Technologies loomed closer, and excitement buzzed through the tech world. Articles about the platform began circulating, touting it as a game changer. Investors spoke of Kellen as a rising star, his reputation growing as fast as the platform's revenue. One evening, as Kellen reviewed the latest financial reports, his phone buzzed with a text from Dan. $300,000 this month. We're crushing it. Kellen allowed himself a rare moment of pride. The numbers weren't just financial success. They were validation. Every late night, every sacrifice, every ounce of self-doubt he had overcome had brought him to this moment. Sitting back in his chair, he let out a long exhale. The faint hum of the monitors filled the silence around him, and for the first time in months, he felt clarity. He didn't need Serena's approval. He didn't need Brielle's validation. His work, his perseverance, and his vision were enough. The rumble of a moving truck pulling into the driveway snapped Kellen out of his thoughts. He froze in his office chair, staring blankly at the glowing monitor before him. The faint sound of footsteps and muffled voices followed, each one sharp and jarring against the quiet of the house. Boxes scraped across the floor, drawers opened and slammed shut, and voices issued clipped instructions. Occasionally, the movers' laughter echoed through the hall, a cruel reminder of the weightlessness of the moment for everyone but him. Kellen glanced at the clock. 9:47 a.m. It was earlier than expected, but Serena had always been strategic. She wanted to leave without confrontation, to treat the dissolution of their family like a transaction. He finally stood and walked to the window, his steps heavy. From the second floor, he had a clear view of the driveway. The movers were loading the last of the boxes into the truck. Serena stood nearby, clipboard in hand, her designer sunglasses shielding her eyes. She looked composed, detached, like she was orchestrating another business deal. Kellen's gaze shifted to Brielle, who stood by the truck's open door, scrolling through her phone. She looked indifferent, her posture casual. Gone was the curious little girl who had once begged him to teach her how computers worked, replaced by a teenager absorbed in the world Serena had shaped for her. His throat tightened as he leaned against the window frame. He watched silently, rooted to the spot. What could he say that hadn't already been said? A sharp knock at the office door broke his trance. Turning, he saw Dan standing there, concern etched across his face. "They're really doing it, huh?" Dan asked quietly, stepping inside. Kellen nodded, his jaw tight. "Looks like it." Dan glanced out the window at the scene below. "You want me to say something?" "Stop them." "No," Kellen said firmly, though his voice wavered. "Let them go. This is their choice." The truck rumbled down the driveway, disappearing from view. Kellen returned to his desk and stared at his monitors. The financial dashboard glowed with the results of his hard work, but the weight in his chest refused to lift. "They'll regret it one day," Dan said, breaking the silence. Kellen shook his head. "Maybe they will. Maybe they won't. But it doesn't matter anymore. This isn't about them." Dan studied him for a moment before nodding. "Good. Because you're building something bigger than their doubts. Let them walk away. You'll still win." Kellen's lips twitched into a faint smile. "I already have." And with that, he turned back to his work, ready to move forward without them. Kellen remained at his desk, the soft glow of his monitors illuminating the shadows of the now empty house. The faint hum of the machines was the only sound, a mechanical reminder of the relentless drive that had brought him here. Though Serena and Brielle's departure still cut deep, something else had begun to solidify within him: determination. The numbers on the screen spoke louder than Serena's dismissive words ever could. Payer Technologies was not just surviving, it was thriving. Another $200,000 in transactions had been processed that day, pushing the platform's monthly revenue even higher than his most optimistic projections. The evidence of his success was undeniable, even if those closest to him had refused to see it. Kellen leaned back in his chair, the weight of exhaustion settling over him. But instead of succumbing to despair, he clung to the work. It wasn't just a distraction. It was his lifeline, his anchor in the midst of the storm. A sharp knock at the door snapped him out of his thoughts. Dan Rivers stepped inside, a bottle of bourbon and 2 glasses in hand. His tie hung loosely around his neck, and his expression was a mix of weariness and pride. "You're still here," Dan said, placing the bottle on the desk with a soft thud. "Not that I'm surprised." Kellen offered a faint smile. "Where else would I be?" Dan poured 2 glasses and slid one across the desk. "To the future," he said, raising his glass. "And to proving everyone who doubted you dead wrong." Kellen clinked his glass against Dan's, the faintest glimmer of a smile tugging at his lips. "To building something that lasts." They drank in silence for a moment, the bourbon burning warm in Kellen's chest. Dan leaned back in his chair, studying him carefully. "You know," Dan began, his tone softer now, "what they did? That's not something you just shake off. It's gonna hurt for a while, Kellen nodded, staring into his glass. I know, and you're okay with just letting it go. Kellen exhaled slowly, his gaze hardening. I'm not letting it go. I'm just not wasting my energy on anger. They've made their choice, Dan. Now I'm making mine. Dan studied him for a long moment before nodding. Fair enough, he said, his voice steady. But just remember, you're not in this alone. As Dan left the room, Kellen turned back to his monitors, the glow of the screen reflecting in his determined eyes. The echoes of Serena's criticisms and Brielle's indifference still lingered, but they were drowned out by the numbers on the screen. His success was real, tangible, and growing stronger by the day. He poured himself into his work that night, each keystroke a quiet declaration of his resolve. The hurt would take time to fade, but he knew that healing would come, not from seeking their approval, but from achieving the vision he had always believed in. They had chosen to walk away, dismissing him as a failure. But Kellen Hayes wasn't just building a company. He was building a legacy, one that would outlast their doubts and stand as undeniable proof of his worth. And when the world finally took notice, Serena and Brielle would be nothing more than spectators, watching from the outside. But by then, it would be too late. Kellen sat at his desk, the quiet hum of his monitors filling the room as he reflected on the day's events. A rare smile played on his lips as he replayed the investor meeting in his mind. The way they had nodded, their initial skepticism melting into enthusiasm, was proof that all the long nights and sacrifices were finally paying off. Dan strolled into the room, a bottle of bourbon in one hand and 2 glasses in the other. Without a word, he poured a drink for each of them, sliding one across the desk. To the grind, Dan said, lifting his glass. Kellen raised his own, to building something that lasts. Their glasses clinked softly before they each took a sip. Dan leaned back in his chair, studying Kellen. You're quieter than usual tonight. Kellen placed his glass on the desk, his fingers tapping lightly against the polished surface. Just thinking about them? Dan asked, his tone cautious. For a while, yeah, Kellen admitted. But now, I'm thinking about what comes next. Dan arched a brow. And what's the plan? Kellen's voice was calm, but resolute. Success. Underscore. The next morning, Kellen and Dan walked into a sleek conference room overlooking the city skyline. The hum of anticipation filled the air as a group of investors gathered around the long glass table. Dan opened the presentation with a pitch polished to perfection, detailing Payer Technology's progress and potential to revolutionize the payment processing industry. When Dan finished, all eyes turned to Kellen. He stood, his movements deliberate, his gaze steady. Payer isn't just another payment processor, he began, his voice steady and authoritative. It's a redefinition of what payment systems can be: faster, more secure, and infinitely scalable. The algorithms we've developed aren't just competitive, they're years ahead. And this is only the beginning. He paused, letting his words sink in before continuing. I understand there are risks. Every startup has them. But look at the growth. Look at the data. This isn't just an idea. It's a revolution, and you have the opportunity to be part of it. The investors exchanged glances, their interest palpable. Questions followed, sharp, probing inquiries about scalability, market reach, and competition. Kellen answered each one with precision and confidence, dismantling any doubts with the same methodical focus he had applied to building the platform. By the end of the meeting, one of the investors rose to shake his hand. We're doubling our commitment, he said firmly. This is something special. As the room emptied, Dan clapped Kellen on the shoulder. You nailed it, he said, grinning. Kellen allowed himself a small smile. We nailed it. Later that evening, back in his office, Kellen reflected on the day. The success of the meeting marked a turning point, not just for the company, but for him personally. For the first time in months, he felt clarity, a renewed sense of purpose. The door creaked open, and Dan walked in with his phone in hand, excitement lighting up his face. Guess who just emailed? He said, holding up the screen. An angel investor from Silicon Valley. Wants in? Kellen raised an eyebrow. How much? Dan grinned. Enough to triple what we just secured. He's been following our progress and doesn't want to miss the boat. Leaning back in his chair, Kellen let the satisfaction settle over him. It's happening, he said, his voice quiet but firm. Dan poured another round of bourbon. It's more than happening, it's taking off. And you know why? Because you didn't quit. Even when everyone else would have folded. Kellen stared into his glass, Serena's words echoing faintly in his mind. You're a failure. Brielle deserves better. Setting the glass down, he met Dan's gaze, his voice steady. Success is the best revenge. Dan smirked, raising his glass. To revenge? Kellen shook his head. To the future, and proving them all wrong. The following weeks were a whirlwind. Payer Technologies secured additional funding, its valuation skyrocketing as word of its innovation spread. Kellen worked tirelessly, refining every detail of the platform and assembling a team of the brightest minds in the industry. One night, as he reviewed the latest transaction reports, his phone buzzed with a text from Dan. $100K in transactions today. We're officially crushing it. Kellen allowed himself a rare, genuine smile. His reply was simple. Just the beginning. He leaned back, the glow of his monitors illuminating his determined face. The road ahead was long, but for the first time, Kellen felt certain he was exactly where he was meant to be. The pain of the past no longer consumed him. It had become the foundation for his success. They had chosen to walk away, but Kellen Hayes wasn't just surviving. He was thriving, and soon the world would know it. The quiet hum of Kellen's office filled the air, a low, steady rhythm that mirrored his heartbeat as he stared at the glowing screen in front of him. Cascading lines of code offered solace, a sense of control in a world that had unraveled so quickly. Since Serena and Brielle left, this space had become his refuge. Every ounce of anger, hurt, and betrayal was poured into the one constant in his life. His work. Each keystroke was deliberate, purposeful, a tangible declaration of his resolve. Kellen had always believed in his vision. But now, it wasn't just about building a successful company. It was about proving, to himself more than anyone, that the value Serena and Brielle failed to see in him wasn't just real. It was immeasurable. Underscore underscore for underscore 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 underscore. That evening, Dan arrived with a bag of takeout in hand and concern etched across his face. He set the bag down on the desk and slumped into the chair across from Kellen. You've been holed up in here for days, Dan said, eyeing him critically. When's the last time you slept? I'm fine, Kellen replied without looking up, his fingers flying across the keyboard. Yeah, you look fine, Dan said dryly. Like someone trying to outrun a train? Kellen paused, his hands hovering above the keys. His gaze flicked toward Dan, unreadable. I have to keep moving? Why? Dan leaned forward. What are you trying to prove? Kellen's jaw tightened, the weight of the question pressing down on him. After a long pause, he exhaled deeply. They didn't just leave, Dan. They left because they didn't believe in me. Serena called me a failure. And Brielle? He swallowed hard. She didn't even hesitate. Dan's easygoing demeanor vanished, replaced by quiet anger. That's on them, not you. Maybe, Kellen said softly. But I can't let that be the end of it. I can't let them define me like that. Dan studied him for a moment, then nodded. Then prove them wrong. Not for them, for you. Kellen's gaze hardened, a spark of determination igniting in his eyes. I will. That night, Kellen worked until dawn, his focus unrelenting. He scrutinized every detail of the platform, refining algorithms, optimizing features, and ensuring the system could handle the rapid growth they were experiencing. Each adjustment felt like a step toward the future he envisioned. A future where his success would speak louder than any word Serena or Brielle had ever said. As the sun rose, Kellen sat back in his chair, surveying his work. The pain of betrayal still lingered, but it no longer consumed him. Instead, it fueled him, driving him towards something greater. The weeks that followed were a whirlwind of progress. Investor meetings, team expansions, and late-night brainstorming sessions filled Kellen's days. His intensity was unmatched, his focus razor-sharp. The company's growth mirrored his transformation, each milestone a testament to his resilience. One afternoon, Kellen and Dan presented Payer Technologies to a new group of investors. The sleek conference room buzzed with anticipation. Kellen's presentation was precise and compelling, his confidence radiating with every word. When the meeting concluded, one of the investors approached him. "Mr. Hayes," he said, extending a hand, "your passion is contagious. I've seen a lot of startups, but this one feels different. You got something special here." Kellen shook his hand, a rare smile breaking through. "Thank you. I believe in what we're building." As the investors filed out, Dan clapped Kellen on the back. "You're killing it, man. They're practically throwing money at us." Kellen's smile faded slightly. "Good. Let's make it count." The team expanded further, bringing in top talent from across the industry. Every decision Kellen made was deliberate, guided by the same unyielding drive that had propelled him forward since the day he resolved to prove his worth. Not to others, but to himself. One night, Dan stopped by the office, carrying an air of excitement. "We just cleared $600,000 this month," he said, dropping into the chair across from Kellen's desk. "That's double what we did last month." Kellen nodded, his expression calm but resolute. "It's a good start." Dan smirked. "A good start?" "Kellen, this is insane growth. You should be celebrating." "I'll celebrate when we hit $1 billion, Kellen replied, his voice steady. Dan raised his hands in mock surrender. "All right, Mr. Relentless. But seriously, this is big. You've built something incredible here." Kellen met his gaze, his expression softening slightly. "We've built something incredible." Dan grinned. "You know, Serena and Brielle, they're going to hear about this eventually. They're going to realize what they left behind." Kellen's gaze hardened. "Let them. By the time they do, it'll be too late." That night, as silence enveloped the office, Kellen reflected on how far he had come. The betrayal that once threatened to break him had instead become the foundation of his resolve. He no longer needed Serena or Brielle's validation. His work, his vision, and his relentless drive were enough. Leaning back in his chair, the glow of the monitors casting shadows across the room, Kellen felt a sense of peace for the first time in months. He had found strength in his pain, transforming it into something extraordinary. And when the world finally saw what he had built, there would be no doubt that Kellen Hayes was a force to be reckoned with. The bright, polished lights of the downtown high-rise conference room reflected off the glass awards adorning the central table. Kellen Hayes stood at the head, flanked by Dan Rivers and their executive team, as journalists and photographers crowded the space. The announcement was historic. Payer Technologies had officially crossed a valuation of $1 billion. Kellen adjusted his tie, his face calm and composed, though the gravity of the moment was not lost on him. Just 5 years ago, this had been nothing more than a dream, a collection of lines of code and sleepless nights. Now, it was a tech powerhouse revolutionizing payment systems across industries. The world was finally taking notice. The magazine covers followed quickly. Forbes dubbed him tech's relentless innovator, featuring a cover story about his journey from junior developer to industry leader. The Wall Street Journal highlighted Payer's groundbreaking algorithms and their impact on global finance, while Time ran a profile titled The Billion-Dollar Visionary. During one such interview, the host leaned forward, her tone curious but respectful. "Kellen, Payer Technologies has achieved what many startups can only dream of. To what do you attribute your success?" Kellen smiled faintly, the expression not quite reaching his eyes. "Persistence. A willingness to see past immediate obstacles and focus on the bigger picture. Any advice for those who look up to you as a role model?" He paused, considering his words carefully. "Success isn't about proving others wrong. It's about proving yourself right. If you believe in what you're building, let that belief guide you. Everything else will follow." The response drew applause from the audience. But for Kellen, it wasn't just a soundbite. It was the truth he had lived by. While Kellen's star continued to rise, Serena and Brielle's lives unraveled. Serena's relationship with Asher Calloway, once a glittering promise of wealth and status, had crumbled under the weight of his fraudulent empire. News of Asher's indictment for financial misconduct spread like wildfire, forcing Serena to leave the luxurious Beverly Hills mansion she had fought so hard to attain. The sleek cars, designer clothes, and lavish parties were gone, replaced by courtrooms and unpaid bills. The private school Brielle attended dropped her from their roster, citing overdue tuition. They moved into a modest two-bedroom apartment in Van Nuys, a far cry from the life Serena had envisioned. One evening, Serena sat at the small kitchen table, staring at a stack of overdue notices. Her once flawless nails tapped anxiously against the edge of the table as she scrolled through her phone, scanning headlines about Kellen's latest triumphs. Billion-dollar innovator Kellen Hayes expands payer technologies to global markets. The accompanying photo showed Kellen standing confidently at a podium, his tailored suit impeccable, the world hanging on his every word. Serena's fingers tightened around her phone. The man she had dismissed as a failure, whose ambitions she had mocked, was now gracing magazine covers. Meanwhile, she was juggling eviction notices and applying for jobs she deemed beneath her. Kellen, however, didn't waste time dwelling on their downfall. His focus remained on the future, on building a legacy that would last long after the pain of betrayal had faded. In his office that night, as he reviewed the company's latest achievements, Kellen allowed himself a rare moment of satisfaction. The numbers, the accolades, the growth, they weren't just proof of his success. They were proof of his resilience. Let Serena and Brielle think what they wanted. Let the world doubt him. When the truth of his success became undeniable, they would all see. And by then, Kellen Hayes would be too far ahead to look back. Brielle wasn't immune to the fallout either. She sat on the edge of her modest bed, scrolling aimlessly through her social media feed. The posts from Madison Walsh and other former friends flaunted designer wardrobes and luxurious vacations, a painful reminder of the life Brielle once envied. Her envy was sharp, but it was overshadowed by something deeper: regret. One post stopped her cold. It was an article about her father. The headline read, "Kellen Hayes launches billion-dollar education initiative." The piece detailed his plan to build technology training centers for underserved communities, designed to empower the next generation of innovators. The accompanying photo showed Kellen standing confidently in a construction zone, his sleeves rolled up as he explained his vision to a group of students. He looked strong, self-assured, entirely unlike the man she had dismissed. Her phone buzzed with a message from Madison. "OMG, why didn't you tell me your dad is, famous now?" Brielle stared at the screen, her stomach twisting. She set her phone down, gazing out the window as her thoughts tangled. She had chosen wealth over loyalty, status over substance. Now, she had neither. For Kellen, the contrast between his rise and their fall wasn't a source of satisfaction, but a quiet reminder of the choices that had shaped them all. He didn't dwell on Serena or Brielle anymore. His focus was on the future, on expanding payer technologies and creating a legacy that would outlast him. One afternoon, Dan walked into his office, holding a tablet. "You might want to see this," he said, placing it on the desk. Kellen glanced at the screen. It was a tabloid featuring a photo of Serena leaving a courtroom. Her once flawless appearance was disheveled, her face drawn with exhaustion. The headline read, "Former tech titan's ex-wife faces financial struggles post-divorce." Kellen studied the image for a long moment before sliding the tablet back to Dan. "Not my concern," he said simply. Dan raised an eyebrow. "Not even a little?" Kellen shook his head. "They made their choices. I made mine." Dan nodded, a glimmer of respect in his expression. "Fair enough." That evening, Kellen stood in his penthouse, overlooking the city lights sprawling out like a constellation. The past was behind him, a series of lessons that had shaped him but no longer defined him. He had built something extraordinary, not for validation, but for himself, for the belief that success, earned through perseverance and integrity, was the ultimate vindication. Somewhere, Serena and Brielle were undoubtedly grappling with the consequences of their decisions. But for Kellen, the only path was forward. He had an empire to grow, a legacy to cement. Turning back to his desk, the glow of his monitors illuminated his face as one thought lingered in his mind. The best revenge wasn't just success. It was thriving beyond anyone's expectations. The courtroom was cold, its sterile walls and unyielding benches offering no solace. Serena Marrero sat at the plaintiff's table, her carefully curated facade cracking under the weight of reality. Her hair was hastily tied back, dark circles rimmed her eyes, and her once pristine designer outfit now felt out of place in the harsh light of scrutiny. Across from her sat Kellen Hayes, composed and unflinching, the picture of control. The judge called the court to order, and Serena's attorney rose to speak, his voice straining under the weak foundation of their argument. "Your Honor," he began, addressing the bench. Mrs. Marrero supported Mr. Hayes during the formative years of Payer Technologies. Her emotional and practical contributions were integral to the company's success. As such, she is entitled to compensation. Kellen's attorney, Michael Chun, rose smoothly, his sharp suit and precise tone exuding confidence. "Your Honor, the evidence will show that Ms. Marrero did not support Mr. Hayes. In fact, she actively undermined him. We have recordings, text messages, and witness testimonies to substantiate this." Serena's heart sank as Michael continued. Her plan had been simple: cast herself as the long-suffering spouse who had sacrificed everything for her husband's success. But now, faced with the meticulous dismantling of her narrative, she realized just how fragile her story was. Michael presented his first piece of evidence, a video recorded during a country club event. The courtroom filled with Serena's own voice, light with laughter, yet dripping with disdain. "My husband? Oh, he plays with computers all day, calling himself an entrepreneur. It's adorable, really?" The recording played on, Serena's dismissive tone cutting through the courtroom's silence like a knife. Michael turned to the judge. "This is just one example of the many ways Ms. Marrero publicly belittled Mr. Hayes and his work." Kellen watched Serena's expression shift from defiance to despair. The truth laid bare had stripped away her veneer. But he felt no triumph, no satisfaction, just a quiet finality. This chapter of his life was closing, and he was ready to move on. That night, as Kellen returned to his penthouse, he stood by the floor-to-ceiling windows, the city sprawling beneath him. The courtroom victory wasn't a moment of revenge. It was a reminder of how far he had come. The people who once doubted him had become irrelevant. Kellen Hayes was no longer defined by their rejection. He was defined by his vision, his work, and the legacy he was building. And as the lights of the city twinkled like a constellation, he knew one thing with absolute certainty: his best was yet to come. The room was silent as the video ended. Serena's face burned, and she avoided the judge's gaze. Michael continued, unfazed. "We also have text messages sent by Ms. Marrero to friends and family, mocking Mr. Hayes' work ethic and ambition. Furthermore, we have documentation of her planning to leave the marriage months before Payer Technologies achieve success." At the defendant's table, Kellen watched Serena without a flicker of emotion. There had been a time when he would have bent over backward to appease her, to win her approval. That time had passed. Now, he listened as Michael methodically dismantled her claims, piece by piece. "Mr. Hayes," the judge addressed him. Kellen stood, his voice steady. "Your Honor, my company's success is the result of years of hard work and sacrifice." The plaintiff abandoned the marriage before this success became public. Her claim is not only baseless, but an insult to those sacrifices. From the gallery, Brielle watched the proceedings with wide eyes. She hadn't wanted to come, Serena had insisted. But now, she couldn't look away. She felt torn, ashamed of the mother who had once seemed so strong and confident, but now appeared desperate and hollow. Yet a deeper shame burned in her chest, knowing she had played a part in betraying her father. Her thoughts swirled as the judge delivered the verdict. Serena's lawsuit was dismissed with prejudice. She was also ordered to pay Kellen's legal fees. Serena's composure cracked, her voice rising in protest. "This isn't fair. I gave him everything." The judge's gaze was unyielding. "Mrs. Marrero, the evidence clearly contradicts your claims. This court will not reward opportunism. You are dismissed." As the courtroom emptied, Brielle caught up to Kellen in the hallway, her voice trembling. "Dad, Wait. Kellen turned, his expression unreadable. What do you want, Brielle? She hesitated, tears brimming in her eyes. I'm sorry. I owe everything. I should have stayed. I should have believed in you. Kellen studied her for a long moment, his voice soft but firm. You made your choice, Brielle. Just like your mother. Now you have to live with it. Please, just let me... Excuse me, Kellen interrupted, his tone final. He walked away, leaving Brielle standing alone in the cold corridor. That evening, Serena sat in their small apartment, staring blankly at a stack of unpaid bills. The court fees had left her finances in shambles, and no amount of pleading had swayed the judge. The walls, once lined with the luxury she had craved, now felt suffocating. The headlines on her phone didn't help. Payer Technologies founder Kellen Hayes prevails in court against ex-wife. Brielle entered the room quietly, her face pale. Mom, she said hesitantly. What do we do now? Serena sighed, her voice hollow. We survive. Across the city, Kellen sat in his penthouse, the skyline a tapestry of lights stretching endlessly before him. He held a glass of whiskey in his hand, the amber liquid catching the glow of his monitors. The headlines were already buzzing with news of the trial, but he paid them little mind. This wasn't a victory to celebrate. It was simply justice served. Dan walked in, holding his own glass. So, that's done, he said, sitting across from Kellen. Feel any better? Kellen shook his head. Not really, but at least it's over. Dan raised his glass. To moving forward, Kellen clinked his glass lightly. To never looking back. As the night stretched on, Kellen returned to his work, the quiet hum of progress drowning out the echoes of the past. For him, the only path was forward, and he had no intention of slowing down. The knock on the door was hesitant, almost timid. Kellen glanced up from his work, his expression hardening as he crossed the room. Opening the door, he was met with Brielle's familiar face, though it carried none of the arrogance he remembered. Her eyes were red, rimmed with tears, and she looked smaller somehow, as if the weight of recent months had diminished her. Dad, she said softly, her voice trembling. Can I come in? Kellen hesitated for a moment before stepping aside. She entered the apartment, her movements uncertain, and stood awkwardly near the edge of the room. The silence between them stretched, heavy and loaded with unspoken words. I know I'm the last person you want to see, Brielle began, her voice barely above a whisper. But I needed to talk to you. Kellen crossed his arms, his face impassive. What is it, Brielle? She looked down, tears spilling onto her cheeks. I'm sorry. For everything. For how I treated you. For choosing Mom's lies over you. Her voice cracked, and she took a shaky breath. Kellen watched her, his expression softening only slightly. It's not enough to be sorry, he said quietly. You have to mean it, and you have to prove it. Brielle nodded, her tears flowing freely now. I will, Dad. I'll prove it. Just please don't shut me out. Kellen sighed, the weight of her words settling over him. We'll see, Brielle. We'll see. As the night deepened, the glow of his monitors illuminated the room once more. For Kellen, the path forward remained unchanged. He had learned to thrive without their approval, and now he was building a future on his terms. Whether Brielle could be part of it was yet to be seen, but for now, he allowed himself a sliver of hope. Kellen's gaze didn't waver. He wanted to feel something: anger, sadness, even pity, but all that remained was a dull ache. You made your choice, he said evenly. You prioritized wealth and appearances over family, over loyalty. I was stupid, Brielle said, her voice trembling with desperation. I believed everything Mom said. I thought it mattered, but it didn't. None of it did. And now that it's gone, you come to me, Kellen replied, his tone cold. Is this guilt, Brielle, or regret? Her silence was answer enough. Kellen sighed, his shoulders heavy with the weight of the moment. You can't undo what you did, he said, his voice firm but not unkind. Trust is earned, not given freely. And you broke mine. Tears streamed down Brielle's face as she whispered. Isn't there any way to fix this? Kellen's expression hardened. No, he said quietly but resolutely. Not now. Maybe not ever. She turned to leave, shoulders hunched in defeat. As she reached the door, Kellen felt a pang of loss resurface, but he let her go, knowing that some bridges were better left burned. The polished glass of Kellen's corporate headquarters reflected the sprawling city skyline, a testament to his growing empire. Inside, the hum of productivity filled the air as employees bustled through the halls, their energy matching the meteoric rise of payer technologies. Kellen stood in his corner office, sunlight streaming through the floor-to-ceiling windows as he reviewed the latest financial reports. The numbers were staggering. Payer had broken into global markets, with revenue projections exceeding even his wildest expectations. A knock at the door broke his focus. Dan stepped in, holding a tablet and wearing his usual grin. Europe's rollout just launched, Dan said, setting the tablet on the desk. User engagement is through the roof. Oh, and Forbes wants to run another feature on you. Kellen allowed himself a faint smile. Schedule it for next month. Let's focus on the expansion for now. You've come a long way, Dan said, sitting down across from him. Feels good, doesn't it? Kellen glanced out the window, his expression thoughtful. It's not about feeling good. It's about building something that lasts. Across town, Serena sat in a worn leather chair in the lobby of a modest real estate agency, clutching her outdated resume. Her once polished appearance had lost its luster. Her tailored blazer was ill-fitted, and her jewelry was borrowed from better days. She glanced at the clock, her nerves fraying with each passing minute. Mrs. Marrero, the receptionist called, her tone perfunctory. Serena rose, forcing a confident smile that didn't reach her eyes. As she walked into the interview room, her phone buzzed with a news alert. Payer Technologies founder Kellen Hayes expands global success. The headline stared back at her, a stark reminder of what she had dismissed. Silencing the notification, Serena stepped into the room, her confidence faltering. In their cramped apartment, Brielle sat on her bed, scrolling through social media. Madison Walsh and others flaunted their designer clothes and luxurious vacations, a painful contrast to her own reality. But it wasn't just envy gnawing at her, it was regret. One post caught her attention. The article detailed her father's latest venture, a scholarship program for underprivileged tech students. The accompanying photo showed Kellen, sleeves rolled up, surrounded by eager young minds. Her phone buzzed. Madison had texted, "OMG, why didn't you tell me your dad is, famous now?" Brielle set her phone down, staring at the peeling paint on the walls. Her mother's choices had led them here, but she couldn't shake the guilt of her own decisions. "Mom?" Brielle called as Serena entered the apartment. "Did you get it?" Serena shook her head, setting her bag down with a heavy sigh. "They said I'm overqualified." Brielle didn't respond. Instead, she whispered, "I want to see Dad." Serena's head snapped up. "Why? After everything, you think he'll just forgive you?" "I have to try," Brielle said, her voice trembling. "I can't keep living like this." A week later, Brielle stood outside Kellen's office building, clutching her phone nervously. She had tried calling, but her messages went unanswered. Now, she was here, hoping to find the courage to walk through the glass doors. Inside, Kellen was finishing a meeting when his assistant appeared in the doorway. "Mr. Hayes," she said cautiously, "your daughter is downstairs." Kellen stiffened, the words hanging in the air. He closed his laptop slowly, his face unreadable. "Tell her I'm busy." The assistant hesitated. She seemed different. "Maybe you should." "I said I'm busy," Kellen interrupted, his tone firm. "Send her away." Downstairs, Brielle waited, her heart sinking as the receptionist delivered the message. "I'm sorry," the woman said kindly. "Mr. Hayes can't see you today." Brielle nodded, blinking back tears as she turned to leave. From his office window, Kellen watched her walk away, her figure small against the backdrop of the city. For a moment, a flicker of doubt crossed his mind, but he pushed it aside. Some wounds took longer to heal, and trust, once broken, wasn't easily restored. As he returned to his desk, the glow of his monitors reflected in his eyes. The path forward was clear. He wasn't defined by the past, not by Serena's dismissal or Brielle's betrayal. He was building something far greater. And for now, that was enough. Kellen sat in his office, the skyline of the city stretching out before him, a gleaming reminder of how far he had come. The quiet hum of the room was interrupted by the soft buzz of his phone on the desk. A message from his assistant appeared on the screen. Serena and Brielle are in the lobby. They're asking to see you. He stared at the words for a long moment, his face impassive. The message carried the weight of unresolved history, but it no longer unsettled him as it might have in the past. The choices had been made long ago, and the consequences were already set in motion. Downstairs, Serena paced nervously in the lobby, her usual confidence frayed. Brielle sat quietly beside her, clutching her phone but avoiding the screen. The opulence of the building seemed to press down on them, a stark contrast to their modest lives now. "He'll see us," Serena said firmly, though her voice carried an edge of desperation. "Mom," Brielle said softly, uncertainty creeping into her tone. "What if he doesn't?" Serena didn't answer. She didn't have to. The fear in her eyes said everything. Upstairs, Kellen rose from his desk and walked to the window, his hands clasped behind his back. He watched the city below, the sprawling streets a reflection of the empire he had built from the ground up. His mind drifted briefly to the past, the moments when he had fought for Serena's approval, when he had believed Brielle's loyalty was unshakable. Those memories felt distant now, like a version of himself he barely recognized. His phone buzzed again. This time, his assistant's voice came through the intercom. "Mr. Hayes, should I send them away?" Kellen turned from the window, his jaw tightening. After a moment, he replied, "Yes, and make sure security knows they are not to return." The message was relayed, and a quiet tension filled the lobby as the receptionist approached Serena and Brielle. "I'm sorry," she said politely but firmly. "Mr. Hayes isn't available and has asked not to be disturbed." Serena's expression faltered, and she glanced at Brielle, who looked down, her face pale. For a moment, it seemed as though Serena might argue, but instead, she simply nodded, her shoulders slumping. "Come on, Brielle," she said, her voice hollow. "Let's go." Brielle hesitated, her eyes flicking toward the elevator bank, as though hoping her father might appear. But when it became clear he wouldn't, she rose silently and followed her mother out the door. That evening, Kellen sat alone in his penthouse, the city lights casting long shadows across the room. On his desk sat a folder filled with documents detailing the next phase of Payer Technology's expansion. He had always been meticulous about planning, ensuring that every decision was calculated, every risk measured. But tonight, his thoughts wandered to the encounter that hadn't happened. He thought of Serena's determination to mold their lives into the image of wealth and status, and how that pursuit had ultimately left her with nothing. He thought of Brielle's once bright curiosity, now dimmed by misplaced priorities and Serena's influence. And he thought of the quiet moments, long gone, when they had felt like a family. Dan arrived, his usual confidence tempered with concern. He poured a glass of whiskey and handed it to Kellen. "So, they showed up," Dan said, sitting across from him. "They did," Kellen replied, his tone neutral. "And you sent them away?" "Yes." Dan studied him for a moment before speaking. "Do you ever wonder if you're being too hard on them?" Kellen took a sip of his drink, the amber liquid warming his throat. "No," he said firmly. "They made their choice. They left when it mattered most, and they did it without looking back." Dan sighed, leaning back in his chair. "I get it, but sometimes people come back because they've changed, not because they want something." "Maybe," Kellen said, his voice calm but resolute. "But I'm not the man they walked away from. I've changed too." As the city buzzed below, Kellen turned his attention back to his work. His empire continued to grow, a monument to his perseverance and vision. Serena and Brielle had chosen a different path, one shaped by short-sighted ambition and misplaced priorities. And now, they were living with the consequences. For Kellen, the choice was clear. The past was behind him, and the future was his to define. He would move forward with the same relentless focus that had brought him here, proving to himself and the world that success wasn't just the best revenge. It was the ultimate validation. Kellen owed them nothing. Brielle had chosen Serena's vision of success over loyalty to her father, mocking and dismissing him at every turn. And now, With the life they'd chosen crumbling around them, they had returned, hoping for forgiveness. They made their choices, Kellen said, his voice colder now. They mocked me, dismissed me, and walked away. And now, when it's all fallen apart, they come back expecting absolution. Danny nodded slowly, his expression contemplative. Fair enough. After Danny left, Kellen returned to his desk. The numbers and projections before him brought clarity, reminding him of the world he had built, not out of revenge, but out of belief in himself. He no longer needed Serena or Brielle's approval, nor did he seek their acknowledgement of his success. This journey was no longer about proving them wrong. It was about proving to himself that he was capable of greatness, independent of their choices or judgments. It was about living a life defined by his values, persistence, integrity, and vision. At the edge of the city, in their modest apartment, Serena sat staring at a blank wall. The weight of rejection and regret pressed heavily on her. Brielle, curled up in the corner, scrolled aimlessly through her phone. She paused on an article about her father's latest initiative. Tech titan Kellen Hayes invests in education for underserved communities. The accompanying photo showed Kellen standing confidently with a group of students, their faces bright with hope and curiosity. Brielle stared at the image for a long moment, her chest tightening. She wanted to try reaching out again, but something in his expression, a quiet strength, an unwavering resolve, told her it was futile. Back in his office, Kellen glanced at the same photo on the wall. The pride it brought him was genuine and unshakable. He had moved on, and there was no room for regret or doubt. The past was behind him, and the future was his alone to define. With that thought, Kellen Hayes turned back to his work, ready to build the next chapter of his legacy. The city stretched out before him, a dazzling mosaic of lights that pulsed with life and possibility. Kellen Hayes stood at the edge of his penthouse balcony, a glass of whiskey in hand, the cool evening breeze brushing against his face. The skyline gleamed before him, a reflection of the journey he had undertaken and the man he had become. For years, the weight of proving himself had driven him, fueled by betrayal and dismissal. He had poured his pain into purpose, his doubt into determination. Now, the results stood as a testament to his efforts. A billion-dollar company, a respected legacy, and a reputation as one of the tech industry's most innovative minds. But for Kellen, success was never about wealth or recognition. It was about impact. The employees whose careers he had nurtured, the students who now saw brighter futures through his scholarship programs, the communities transformed by his vision. That was the meaning he cherished, the reward that mattered most. For a brief moment, his thoughts wandered to the shadows of his past. Serena and Brielle's departure had once felt like a wound too deep to heal. But now, the pain was distant, like an old scar, visible but no longer tender. Their choices had shaped their paths, just as his choices had defined his. He wished them no harm, but he knew with certainty that leaving them behind was the right decision. Taking a slow sip of his drink, he savored the warmth that spread through his chest. This was freedom. Freedom from the need for validation, from the ghosts of disappointment, from the weight of his past. As he turned back toward his office, the glow of his monitors casting soft light across the polished floor, Kellen allowed himself a faint smile. His reflection caught his eye, and for the first time, he didn't see a man haunted by betrayal. He saw someone defined by resilience and vision. He had built something extraordinary, something lasting, something meaningful. And in that quiet moment, Kellen Hayes knew he was exactly where he was meant to be. Sometimes, betrayal and heartbreak are not the end. They're the beginning of a journey toward growth and self-discovery. Kellen Hayes' story reminds us that resilience, self-belief, and determination can turn even the darkest moments into the foundation for a brighter future. If you've ever faced betrayal or doubted your worth, remember, success isn't about proving others wrong. It's about proving to yourself that you are capable of greatness. Thank you for watching this story on Reddit Cheating Stories. If you enjoyed it, please like, subscribe, and hit the notification bell so you never miss another story. Share your thoughts in the comments. We'd love to hear from you. See you in the next video.